Okay, so okay, good, thanks. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming out for the project reviews for the second year of the New Normal postgraduate program here at the Strelka Institute in Moscow. For those of you who are new to the program, watching the feed online, I'm going to begin with a little bit of a discussion, a little bit of introduction to the program that we put together here, and to the work that you're going to see over the next 2 days. This is, of course, day 1 of 2 of the work. We've got 8 projects that our 32 researchers have put together over the past 5 months. The program is compressed into those extremely intensive 5 months, where we go from 0 to 60 quite quickly and keep up the intensity for this 24/7 program that as we do. And today we'll see some of the results of this work. But first of all, I want to give my thanks to the staff here at Strelka, the whole educational program team, Nikolai, Olga, Masha, Varvara, Elena, and really the whole Strelka team, without whom all of this couldn't have happened. I also want to extend my thanks to the 40-plus faculty who have taught in this program over the last 5 months, some of whom are joining us here today. These include Liam Young, Lev Menovich, Mette Haven, Keller Easterling, Ben Cerveny, Etienne Turpin, Petra Blaise, Dunan Raby, Trevor Paglin, Yukui, and many others besides. So in addition to this very intensive sequence of studios and seminars that we've conducted together over these few weeks, the researchers also did 2 intensive research trips to Magadan in Siberia and to Shenzhen and Hong Kong in China as well. I want to give a little bit then of sort of contextual introduction to the kinds of projects that you're going to see and what, in a way, what the questions are that these projects are attempting to answer or to address in their own particular way. Some of the projects may appear to look a bit less like architecture and more like art or software. This is, in fact, part of the plan, part of the strategy for how it is that we seek to define what urban design is, the entry points into what cities are, what cities can be, how we might rethink them, we might remake them, and ultimately what kinds of design practices are needed to compose and to model the kinds of cities that we need. Within those models, what you're going to see is a kind of range of different types. We like to say that that design has a facility in models that are descriptive, predictive, and also projective, that are meant to models of not what is or what is likely to happen, but in fact what we think should happen. We think of cities themselves as not just a place in which or on top of which technologies may intervene, but cities themselves are the fundamental technology in which we live. We inhabit the city as a distributed, collective technology. And so the design of the technology and the design of the city, in many respects, converge. One of the ways in which we see this convergence, and we attempt to enter into the design questions, is around questions of platforms. Artificially intelligent platforms, naturally intelligent platforms, and particularly in how thinking about how it is that these platforms see the world, how they sense the world, how they categorize what they sense, how they categorize us, how they act upon the ways in which they sense and the ways in which they develop knowledge about the world, knowledge about us in turn. You're also going to see, given as you might be rather different than a more traditional urban design program, many of the projects tell the story through cinematic means. And so the status of the image within design and within the city itself is something that is really core to the kinds of questions that we're asking. What you'll see are images that attempt to, again, describe a situation as it exists, images that imply an interactivity, that they would, by interacting with this image, that they would cause to happen something that image represents. You see images that operate at the level of a simulation, that they become in and of themselves a kind of complex system that would organize the city according to its own semiotics, according to its own logics of representation. You'll also see images that, in fact, do what they represent, operational images, where the image itself is the technology that develops, that does what it represents. So, last couple points, and then I'm going to introduce our first project, Geocinema. All of these projects are interested in, I think, in important ways in how it is that design itself needs to be redesigned or reconceptualized. They attempt to, in a way, go to the roots of these issues. They are each radical in their own way, in the true sense of the word of going to the root, and are interested in how it is that these kinds of gestures can have outsized influences. Lastly, and since this is really a review of the projects, and a word on the program for today. Each of the projects will have about 20 minutes to present the work. Our esteemed panel we've gathered here today, from my left to right, Etienne Turpin, writer-designer based in Berlin and Jakarta. Patricia Reed, theorist and designer based in Berlin. Jennifer Leong, architect based in New York and Cambridge. Ben Cerveny, designer and technologist based in Amsterdam and Los Angeles. Anastasia Smirnova, architect based in Rotterdam and Moscow. And Denis Leontiev, architect here at Strelka KB, based in Moscow. We'll conduct together a conversation in which we try to unpack the arguments that are implied and communicated within each of these projects together. I should say that the projects, in a way, are meant to be seen not as final studio projects where everything is sort of nicely and cleanly wrapped up and with the bow on top, but rather as first steps and prototypes towards projects that the groups will take on over the coming months. We like to say that the real deliverable of our program is new design practices. And so in the spirit of that, the conversation of how we can build on this as well. Okay? So let me introduce then our first project. I'm going to take a little bit longer in this introduction than I will in some of the others, because in many ways this project serves as a kind of thesis statement for what comes next. So the project is called Geocinema. And with this first project, we should take it for a kind of establishing shot, if you will, for the subsequent interventions. Among the critical variables that we've developed in the course of our months together is a working distinction between the global and the planetary. In our shorthand, the global may refer to a singular, encapsulated, self-transparent figure inside of which regional and local operations are situated. One derived from modern geodesy and cartography, and in collaboration with the cosmologies that underwrite the political architectures that seek to steer this domain. Whereas the planetary may refer to a conception of our perch in which all of these human, all too human, geographic universalizations of the global, those and all the governing artifacts that ensue, are understood as local instances, examples of the biosemiotic gestures within complex geologic systems, including climate systems that happen to be made by a particular sapient species. So here, our cultures and our languages, our images and our politics are not just inside of planetary systems, they are themselves thermodynamic intensities of those systems. One lesson of the Anthropocene, then, is that our assemblages, the cities, the states, the societies, not only ride on the planetary, they in turn recursively re-affect those systems. So what we'll see is a proposal for, in a way, a new way of seeing these relationships, a new kind of cinema, one that will hopefully also retrain us to see images with which we think we are familiar. So to do this, we would first then have to ask, how may our apparatuses of perception allow not only us to see worlds differently, but for some of the systems in which we are inevitably embedded and in which we embody to see themselves differently through the mechanisms that we make. In this sense, this means, as said, not only a new kind of, in short, a new kind of cinema. Now, by cinema, then, we would mean something rather different than the traditional camera obscura kind of model. But it would mean one that is not only operant and which operates at the planetary scale, but which is configured in its own sensory environment in ways that parallel how subsystems are linked in the open wound of planetarity itself. And if it seems fabulous, perhaps, but in a way, as this project will show, it already exists. We just don't know what to do with it yet. We don't know what kind of cinema to make with this system or what it demands. That said, we certainly have no shortages of images of Earth. However, what we still need to learn then is how to see them and how to be seen by them. So instead of a greater closure, this proliferation of trillions and trillions of traces requires secondary apparatuses to stitch it together into semi-legible wholes. The images it makes are themselves always artifacts of signal and noise negotiation. And so Geocinema would have to include not only the machines that make raw data, but the supply chains of perception that turn these into actionable information. This is not to say that there is no there, or that the whole thing is an endless game of intertextual power plays. Reality still bats last. For example, climate change is a phenomenon that is known and understood not because of a single thermometer readout. It is a figural truth that is composited together from thousands of different kinds of sensing: air temperature, ice core sampling, ocean heat exhaust, and so on. Each draws a partial image, but in the accumulation and normalization of these traces, an underlying universal process, namely climate change, comes into focus. Sorry. This is why the geopolitical stakes then could not be higher. At a moment when the proliferation of media technologies comes with itself a proliferation of embedded micro-realities and Potemkin ontologies, the means for understanding how they may come to form, like the figure of climate change, is the basis of means by which images of the real might take on the force of the real. If human political systems are one medium through which planetary systems may self-regulate, then geocinematic disclosures may live there. And so what you will see is a proposal for that geocinema, a cinema on behalf of this. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Alexei Orlov, filmmaker from Moscow.
I'm Solveig Sus, based in London.
I'm Asebaz Drevaki of Ukraine. At least 20 million containers are currently traveling across the oceans, each sending real-time tracking signals. A network of seismic alarms are buried in permafrost to provide alerts over methane eruptions, registering every 3 seconds. 60 hours of videos are uploaded every minute, with 1 hour of videos uploaded to YouTube every second, bringing together methods of planetary networks of sensing, from billions of cell phones, surveillance cameras, to thousands of satellites and geosensors. A cinematic matrix is composed from various sensory data available, from the hyperspectral vision to the seismic or tracking system of chemical composition to biological rhythms.
We consider these planetary-scale sensory networks together as a vastly distributed cinematic apparatus, a camera. If we take the Latin etymology of cinema, with its roots in kinematics, meaning movements, and graphy, in writing, we look to various scales of movements graduated between geological longue durées to infrastructures that move matter across territories, tuning into mediums which frame and write movements across time. Sensing fragments of the Earth, each signal and transfer runs through their own sets of scales and temporalities while producing terabytes of raw data. The representation of the Earth is the sum of a decentralized editing process with its image anything but whole.
Our method is informed by these techniques of sensing, tracing house of their stitching processes, used for empirical observation, surveillance, verification, and tracking. It is within these processes that fit into a type of visual culture, where they co-edit into an archive of and for an uncertain future present. If this camera, through its montage and intervals, is framing a form of geocinema, can this also be a mode of seeing otherwise?
A series of investigations that test the claims of geocinema unfolds in 4 parts. Each follows entangled strands into what these sensing networks might mean through an expanded field of cinema.
Every 16 days, the Earth's surface is fully scanned by land satellites. Trailing the mid-morning light, they orbit the Earth every 90 minutes, covering it with a track shot of 30 meters in resolution, as they have for the past 40 years. Along with hundreds of others, they record, label, and package huge amounts of data before being sent to allocated ground stations, where select files are processed and archived.
On ground, the Moscow Meteorological Station conducts an hourly routine
registering air and soil parameters, in sync with other stations across the world, under Greenwich Mean Time. Aggregated through telegrams, they are only part of a network of centers that together deliver a weather forecast. The genre of geocinema is and was never about Earth, because there is no Earth. Earth exists as many, always composite and patchy, manufactured and stitched together into a montage of the globe. Directed by its metadata, the representation of the Earth is the result of a decentralized editing process.
Across the thin skin of the planet, a superabundance of energy is garnered through solar radiation. Matter registers environments as light and landscapes are in constant process of co-creation. Recording all kinds of stimuli, the way these processes are registered, being camera-less images, act more like skin than they do eyes. The encounter between photosynthesis and cyanobacteria can be seen as documented through processes such as formations of crystals. Electrical currents move between scales of the brain, from 12 volts to that between clouds and the surface of the Earth with 100 million of volts of potential. Data is only one interpretation of light, as electricity pulsations manufacture its images. For when photons travel, they embed themselves into a prosthesis for how Earth senses itself.
Along the Eurasian corridor, pixels are sharpening, while fresh telecommunication bands, carrying logistical accounts, waft through radio waves. A sharp rise in vibrations can be felt across seismographs. Records of Earth's new movements are actively purchased by construction companies to moderate the flattening of mountains or the blasting of terrain, while new concrete pathways gloss over the otherwise uneven landscapes. Our current geological epoch, the Anthropocene, describes the shifts in the Earth's own physical processes as human disturbances become forces of change, outweighing that of glaciers. Here, we see that the sensing and imaging of the Anthropocene also coincides with its making.
Scientifically, they say that story is logic. But I am not your history. I am a satellite.
The Tunguska explosion was noted to be one of the largest impact events recorded in history. Millions of trees have been found to be knocked down, pointing away from an area over eastern Siberia. But the first pictures of the site were taken more than a decade after the event itself, registered only through erratic testimony. Modern myths pour out of this event, explaining into what might exist in between and beyond modes of sensing operations. High-speed cameras capture 250 frames per second, while surveillance cameras register 15. 240 car license plates are fed through traffic centers every minute and archived for 7 days only before being discarded. Despite the pace of visual traffic, with its shutter speed of 60 hours of YouTube videos uploaded per second, it seems that along the way, something else slips past the archives of our present.
Now for something slightly different. As mentioned in my opening remarks, one of the ways in which we are looking at urban systems is in relation to platform systems. Platforms as a kind of urban scale system by which a certain set of rules or protocols are put into place on which other kinds of things can grow. Correspondent to this is in research has been, as mentioned, an interest in AI at landscape scale, particularly automation. And in this, we think of AI not as just as a kind of synthetic algorithmic force that sits on top of a natural biological given, but rather is something that can be very closely interwoven with the ground on which it sits. We're also interested, we've also been investigating and sort of framing this question of AI not as a kind of machine that has all of the answers, that if you simply would perfect this oracle, that its output would consolidate the mysteries into a singular response. But it's something that's interesting and valuable as a technology, as an epistemological technology, because of its adversarial quality, because it is a form of mineral intelligence that sees the world differently, that is able to sense the world differently, and because of that, it's something with which we can, in turn, compose the world differently, including the parts of the world that we eat, the parts of the world that in our literal ingestion become us. So in this case, the landscape scale phenomenon that we're working with is agriculture, is the deliberate planning, structuring, and sourcing of landscapes that would, in fact, become part of our own process, our own biology. And in this, besides indexing the raw versus the cooked, and thereby nature versus culture, food, quote unquote, suggests all kinds of juicy philosophical complexities as the matter that becomes us. Sorry, I had to. So defined in this way, yeah, then food is the world that we ingest, making it a special category of things, even if its chemistry is not shared by what is not food. The distinction then is based not only on how mammal physiology draws nutrition from some things and not other things, but also on conceptual and conventional distinctions as well. That said, we don't only eat matter that is nutritious. We also drink poisons all the time. We swallow much that our bodies filter out as unsuitable, and in fact, special organs have appeared and evolved to manage exactly this. So in this spirit, we suggest that the term factory farming should be rescued from its current connotations, and that in the mass cultivation of raw materials, we need sources of food that make wasteful means obsolete, with an eye towards forms of ecological restoration at scale, which may mean bringing the landscapes indoors. And in this case, it's landscapes that think about landscapes, landscapes that we ingest. And so, as you'll see in this project, that AIs that supervise those landscapes, that grow the food that we eat, in turn, the AI are, in essence, also growing us. I'll leave it at that, please. Thanks.
Hey, hello everyone. My name is Ivan. I am a technologist focused on augmented and virtual reality from Yekaterinburg.
I'm Lyudmila Saveleva, artist and photographer from Moscow.
I'm Paul Van Herk. I'm an architect from Melbourne, Australia.
I'm Thomas Grogan. I'm an artist from London. Our project is called Tuda Syuda, which can be translated back and forth, but not only. Over the past week, we've been interested in the link between landscape design and food consumption through the eye of artificial intelligence and the role it can play within this interplay. We will present two videos, one a documentation of a research and the other one a design proposal.
Please enjoy. Food has always terraformed, and landscapes have always created recipes. As instruments of this feedback, humans have been making active correlations between ingredients and terrain for millennia, shaping landscapes to live in and shadow landscapes to feed from. These landscapes overlap in what Europeans still call the countryside. We began this project by asking how the ritual acts of eating and shaping landscapes can be put in a more explicit interplay to the benefit of both. We first visited an agri-tourism operation near Moscow that builds pleasant and productive landforms together. We discovered that it was unprofitable and fantastically inefficient at both, very difficult to picture at platform scale. Platforms already do food. IBM's Chef Watson is an AI that produces quirky recipes based on patterns of ingredients that tend to appear together in its dataset of dishes. Pairing companies like Deliveroo link establishments to individuals. Blue Apron penetrates further into the private domain, delivering ingredients and recipes to dormant kitchens and podcasts. They pitch a more direct connection between food manufacturers and urban eaters, but at the same time, retain the integrity of recognizable ingredients and the aesthetics of provenance. We were fascinated by their bucolic and Puritan representations of source and site, best exemplified in the slogan, "Food is better when you start from scratch." The history of Russian agriculture teaches us that there will be no starting from scratch. Our research took us through the Stolypin reforms that privatized feudal land holdings and led to the Bolshevik Revolution. We visited the Soviet 5-year plans that forced predetermined reaping patterns on the Russian landscape and led to mass starvation. In a meeting with the Minister for Agriculture of Moscow region, we learned about current government incentives to develop vast abandoned growing sites surprisingly close to the city and still very cheap. Low capital investment monocultures are still standard practice in Russia, just like in other landed states. Wheat, meat, and dairy. The sanctions of 2014 put pressure on the foreign supply of fresh fruit and vegetables, which hold a special luxuriant status in Russia. The following year, a 31-hectare greenhouse complex was built on the outskirts of Moscow at a cost of $500 million. The cucumbers within it grow quickly and predictably. They are monitored intensively around the clock and throughout all seasons. Agricultural interiors such as these are becoming standard fixtures of European landscapes. The lingering conflation of nature and agriculture has been a disaster for both, and their separation must be completed for the sake of other remaining ecosystems. The energy intensiveness of bringing crops indoors may be justifiable if they are located close to sites of consumption, and the intensity of their outputs is dialed right up. The trophic cascades of forests and the backyard growing movements that mimic them work too slowly and at too small a scale to be of much help to us. But if new ecosystems can be synthesized indoors, they do not have to follow the same steps, rules, and pace. If new ecosystems are synthesized, then so should their products be. Our attachment to the consistent identities of what we eat is so strong that entire biomes have been demolished for it. We are proposing bounded landscapes that are sensed and expressed by an AI that manages their intensity and complexity. Artificial intelligence is already widely used in agriculture, mostly for tracking and monitoring. Machine vision is used to identify defects and diseases in plants 24 hours a day. It can determine when a goat is ready to mate from the way it walks when it goes to be milked. Soil sensors measure chemistry, water content, and acidity. Robotics are used to weed and plant and pick produce. IoT devices already address boxes and crates. Location trackers are tinier than ever. It is a very small step to imagine the management of whole sites by AI systems that index the growth, interaction, and formation of multiple hybrid species at once. This slightly echoes the permaculture principles of companion planting and food forests, but at a much faster pace and with much stranger outputs. AI that senses a landscape must also express that landscape's propensity for experimentation. It may be the human taste for predictability and equilibrium that destroys ecologies. Taste, after all, eats itself. The name of this project is Tuda Syuda, which means back and forth in Russian. It has slightly dirty, hustling connotations. It represents the central idea of two AIs that negotiate food and landscape priorities between them. In testing the conversations they might have, we started to see an undeniably social interaction form, stripped of culture and relentlessly cooperative. For example, if one proposes the addition of something new into their exchange, the other may reject thousands of iterations of it until its own oblique priorities are satisfied. As millions of these negotiations take place in both directions at once, the pace and complexity of cooperation increases geometrically. The AIs do not see the whole picture though, because in isolation or totality, they would approach vanishing points of artificial idiocy. Their dialogue of misunderstanding mimics the experimentation of an ecosystem, the optimization of interrelations, rather than of fixed outcomes. As humans are necessary instruments in the interplay of food and landscape, they must be immersed into the conversation too. Image and speech have become the common ground for testing machine learning outputs, but AI has already proven itself as a master creator of new textures and mistaken identities. Machine-generated textures can express the surface qualities of construction materials and edible substances together. They can be built and ingested on the same plane. Textures have long been an interchange between food and landscape aesthetics, from still life to impressionism to Shutterstock. As an interchange between senses, textures can be understood by touch and taste, as well as sight and sound. For our purposes, texture is a rich and fuzzy interchange that can be juxtaposed against the accountability of natural language processing. The video that follows is the demonstration of an immersive virtual space that is both system diagram and interface. It can be navigated as a three-dimensional time machine that displays the history of the dishes for purchase at one end and their accompanying landscapes at the other. In the middle are the textures of the negotiation between them. The interface becomes the decor for new dining rituals that take place in the display of their own effects, products, and origins, an augmented reality in a meaningful sense.
Tuda Syuda is a platform that generates new forms of food and agricultural landscape simultaneously. At its center are two artificial intelligence systems that are in constant negotiation with each other. They are called Chef and Farmer. Chef is constantly experimenting with new ingredients and inventing new dishes for human consumption. Chef registers and predicts the probable tastes of human users as they move through the interface looking to order something fresh. Chef sees food as relative qualities, flavor profiles, textures, and colors. Chef is not attached to existing ingredients, traditions, or provenance. The dishes that humans find in the interface usually are not available for long. As each recipe expires, a new one replaces it. The preparation of each dish begins weeks in advance, in a dialogue between recipe and the landscape that generated its strange ingredients. Moscow is surrounded by a belt of underutilized farmland that was abandoned at the end of the Soviet era. This land has a very short growing season and was typically used for milk and meat production. Large government incentives have led to the rapid expansion of semi-automated indoor agriculture at an immense scale. As a periphery of agricultural interiors begins to form around the city, these sites become laboratories for experimenting with the direct feedback of food and landscape. In Tuda Syuda, these agricultural scale interiors are conceived of as a space of complex and overlapping speciation, rather than singular production line monocrop. These interiors may contain outdoor spaces, yet they are bounded from forest reserves, marshes and wildlife corridors. Through Farmer, each site develops its own organizational logic and codependencies. Some contain recreation and therapeutic uses for humans. Just like Chef, Farmer needs humans to terraform. The sites are built and reshaped by administrators who read Farmer's outputs. Farmer use intricate sensing apparatuses to log data ranging from soil pH and companion adjacencies to individual produce tracking. Farmer therefore understands food products very differently to how Chef understands them, because Chef is sensitive to human taste, texture and color. Over time, Chef and Farmer develop correlational understandings of what things are to each other. They make their exchange in relative qualities of foodness and landscapeness. In a dialogue of requests, suggestion and rejection, Farmer suggests new ingredients for Chef, and Chef suggests new arrangements for Farmer. Their separation is key. It introduces checks and balances of both sides of the experimentation. An ingredient that is not advantageous to a landscape will not be produced, nor will a landscape that is not palatable. If one rejects the suggestion of the other must suggest again and again and again. They do not tire of this, their ability to cooperate is beyond any human institution. When the human users select a dish, they are presented with the archive of the conversation that produces it. These become an ingredient list with condensed history beyond mere chemistry. As eating events are constructed around the dish by humans, their terraforming consequences are made immersive. In time and in space. The experimental tendencies of Earth, ecologists and taste-making are drawn even more in alignment. Bit by bit. Back and forth.
Of simulation systems in design, but takes a very different, I think, a very different take on it, asking different questions and coming to a different series of answers. One of the things that we've been researching quite with some detail in the program this year was a shift in a shift in the structure of urban scale AI systems from an emphasis on the processing capacities of particular systems to the sensing capacities of those systems. And to a certain degree, as the processing hardware gets cheaper and smaller and faster, the difference between how a system thinks and what a system is capable of comes down to what it's capable of sensing. And so the simulation is not just a simulation of the information processing, it's a simulation of its inputs and outputs. Altai is another project in which we'll see a blending of synthetic and natural intelligences, of organic and inorganic intelligence, of carbon and non-carbon based sensing and processing into various dynamic recursive systems, by which the search simulations and search vectors within biological systems become so entangled with the search vectors within the synthetic algorithmic systems that it's impossible to disentangle their coevolution with one another. Part of that coevolution is it becomes the disclosure and acceleration of different kinds of adaptive and co-adaptive agencies and behavior. Among them, display, camouflage, showing and not showing, triggering and not triggering. And a hint towards, as well, the urban scale adaptations and precedents for this. For example, how QR codes have appeared as a kind of environmental evolutionary response to the presence of handheld cameras. The ways in which images and machine-readable images become not only mechanisms by which systems represent themselves and simulate themselves, they in fact become operations and devices within those systems on their own part. So with that, it's my pleasure to wrap up our first evening with Altai.
Hello, my name is Chao. I'm a programmer from Berlin.
Hi, my name is Paul. I'm a designer from Berlin.
Hello, my name is Daria Stupina. I'm an architect based in Moscow.
Hey, my name is Lukáš Likavčan and I'm a philosopher from Slovakia. And what you're going to see now in a short while is a simulation called Altai. It's an agent-based simulation which is inspired by rich aesthetics, cultural practices, and ecologies which come from a remote mountain region of Altai. This region is on crossroads between 4 countries: China, Russia, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan. And the simulation itself is set in scenario of automated landscape, where biological species, machines, and environments interact to produce unforeseeable visual outputs. Let us unpack now at the beginning the conceptual motivations behind building this simulation. First, at the moment, we are facing an emergence of automated landscapes. It's a dramatic change in the composition of Earth's landscape, in the sense that we humans are slowly obsolete in cities, in countrysides, in logistical hubs, in ports, for example, or in the industrial parks or whatever. We can presume that this kind of change will soon hit also remote regions, such as pristine valleys or mountain systems. And there are certain design challenges we face in automated landscapes. First design challenge is the challenge of how to design address and identity layers for these automated landscapes. And there's a certain unsettling similarity between the kind of ontology which might be instrumental in building these address layers and the ontology of animism. Animism understood as a kind of ontology where each entity, whatever it is on the same par, shares the same generic space, and these entities differ between each other only in terms of their bodily appearance, of their corporeal or physical body. Secondly, how to design machine-to-machine interactions in these automated landscapes. Let us look at one specific example, and that's the example of authentication. What we usually mean by authentication is a kind of process where we check, or some entity checks some specific imprint or a unique footprint of an entity, meaning that this footprint is, for example, what the agent has, what the agent knows, or what the agent is or does. Now, can we use images to encode these behaviors? Can we use images to make them basically work as a kind of instrument for authentication? Well, at the moment, we have, for example, QR codes that work this way. They work as operational images. What are operational images? They are not representation of some process. They are this process themselves. They are the machine that facilitates this process. Before we move to the simulation itself, let me unpack the other conceptual motivations. Here now we are in Russia. And Russia historically is a country that was governed from one node, either St. Petersburg or Moscow. And the governors here were using models, maps, or simulations to actually see this territory as a governable wall. But what if we bracket off the territory and we are left with the model itself? Can there be some space of sovereignty in the simulation itself? What I understand by simulation is a kind of model. A model is a mapping that ignores some traits of the entity while it makes other traits of the entity pronounced, or a territory. And specifically, simulations are also kinds of models which are dynamic, which are complex, and which are closed systems. So imagine them as little petri dishes, for example. Agent-based simulations are kinds of simulations where agents spontaneously interact between each other. They are good in modeling one specific kind of phenomena, and that's emergence. Emergence is what occurs in complex adaptive systems. Complex adaptive systems are systems where these agents have different sort of evolutionary strategies they use to adapt to each other. And these evolutionary strategies can be viewed as a kind of signaling games. For example, an orchid mantis mimics an appearance of a flower. Why it does it? It does it because it wants to tease a bee, it signals itself as something else that it really is, and then the bee comes, the mantis grabs the bee and eats it.
So, we are landing now in a particular ecosystem. This is Altai environment. It is a last mountain range in a completely remote conditions. Multiple cultural routes went through this region over the time, leaving layers of history. It is a unified place chopped into 4 slices by borders conditions. These are Russia, China, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan. In our simulation, we have 3 main components. Agents that perform certain rituals in certain environments. And now I will unpack the environments part. We've made a research on conditions and history of this region and extracted 7 layers at different altitudes with specific flora and fauna and cultural footprints. For example, we have glacier and tundra, and they are characterized by certain features in the simulation. Environment provides a model for simulation. It informs spatial locations of agents and influences their behavior. Border conditions are also implemented into the system by providing additional rules for the agents flowing through the simulation. So, environment is represented in 2 ways. One is through the 2D interface of the overall region and as a number of 3D models of specific locations of each of the 7 layers. So, For them, we picked notable places, such as the highest summit of Altai, Beluga Mountain.
Distilling our research on evolutionary strategies, our agents are built on the vocabulary of both animism and automation. Our agents share properties of both mechanic and biological properties.
To unfold the visual representation of an agent, we see two dimensions encoded into the representation of an agent. On the bottom, you see the taxonomy of a so-called family type. The family type of an agent influences its outer shell, the materiality, and its general form. On the other hand, the actual agent type defines its inner desire, its behavior, and its kind of potential rituals it can perform.
This taxonomy is not an act of reduction, but rather we look at how these attributes can build on top of each other. So let's look at some agents. On the top, you have the recognition flower. It camouflages at the same time that it records its surroundings. Plant-like, machine-like machines. Then we have the isolation, sorry, down here. Then we have the isolation silicon, dwelling in higher altitudes of the glacier. We ask questions of what happens when species collide, and we ask what happens when material starts to have its own agenda. It's not a kind of symbiosis, but exhibiting a tendency with cross-pollination. Then we have rituals. Rituals are defined by rule-based practices that happen at a given time in a specific environmental setting.
And by means of talking about rituals, we want to highlight one thing, and that's a certain relation between practices or actions and an institution of collective memory, in the sense that you can basically bootstrap new practices from this collective memory. And this is basically like the phenomena of emergence I've been talking about at the beginning. So now let's move to the another part about the dramaturgy of the simulation. We have basically 3 stages in which the simulation in each situation unfolds. First, you have a certain metagram. We will unpack in a while what it means. Then you have a scene itself, some 3D representation. And then you have a cosmogram, which is a product of a scene. I will explain now everything. Let's first go to the scene.
So, a quick demo of the scene. As a trans agent performing a passage ritual, border crossing is symbolic in the sense that when one enters the zone of receptions, it receives a packet of data or some sort of state changes that allows us a corporal transformation. This is the data meal.
Border crossing. Yeah. Okay, and at the end of each scene, you get this thing called cosmogram. Let me remind you, at the beginning I was talking about the operational images, and basically understand cosmogram as an operational image, as a sort of aestheticized ID of the agent within the scene, within the ritual. Cosmograms are first, thus some kinds of footprints and encodings of the footprints of the agents, and secondly, they are also interface of our simulation. We've been inspired in creating this idea of cosmogram by our research in icons. What are icons? Icons are first, according, for example, to Charles Sanders Peirce, a kind of signs which are constructed by means of analogy. And secondly, icons are interfaces of mediation of some processing, for example, algorithmic processing. We've been inspired here by our research in the way how icons work in religious practices. They are, for example, images that mediate certain act of worshipping or another kind of ritual. And in a secularized variant, they can be used exactly as this kind of interfaces for algorithmic processing. And on the overall level of the simulation, you have like one big map. The map is called metagram, sorry. And the metagram itself is a kind of general map that shows all the happenings ongoing within the simulation at a given time.
And after this introduction of all of these new notions, just a quick recap of what we learned. On the left side, on the y-axis, you see all of the ingredients that come into play in our simulation: environment, agent, and ritual. On the x-axis, you see the actual visual layers of our simulation: scene, cosmogram, and metagram. And since our simulation is agent-based but ritual-centric, the actual scene where we can actually witness the ritual is the most aesthetically detailed one. So it's full of these 3D environments. 3D agents and the rituals are depicted by traces. And as we go on from scene, which leaves kind of an imprint, or like as Lucas framed it within the notion of operational images, we come to this notion of cosmogram, which then reduces each visual layer to one dimension, and then coming to the metagram, which can be seen as a kind of archive of cosmograms, you land in a further abstraction which then orders as kind of interface to actually access all of the other cosmograms.
So basically, our simulation is a petri dish that grows images, and we will unpack now how this process of growing these images works.
Yeah, we have conceived 4 stages of simulation that work as anchors of evolutionary process. Stage 0 is called fully automated landscape. This is the stage where we have 2 agents, recognition and sensor. They are performing quantification rituals and building spatial model of environment.
Stage 1, nature strikes back. We foresee a kind of calibration, some sort of thermodynamics, tuning. Here is a sense of predator and prey dynamics, establishing cyclical changes, things like the Lorentz attractor or Levy's flight, more organic behaviors.
Stage 2, renaissance of civilization. It is where the first inhabitants, the major part of our agents, appear. They set up social structures, populate and regulate their behavior, building up networks.
And then finally, this is where our imagination hits a limitation. We foresee a kind of new emergence with these co-evolution and co-adaptations.
After setting up all of these stages and the actual variables, we now have a look how the simulation actually works together in terms of rule setting. What we can see here is a organigram, which basically represents all of the rules that are kind of coming into play in this kind of simulation. Starting with the actual environment. The environment in our simulation is an actual actor, so it has events in itself. It can have catastrophes, it can inhabit cyclical resets, but also seasons. In total, we have 7 environment types that Dasha already introduced, and each of these environment types can inhabit certain agent types. We have 9 in total. That were the one we introduced, and they are connected to a certain stage. So each of the agent comes into the simulation at a certain stage, encoded by these white rectangles. Each agent then has also intrinsic as well as extrinsic variables, which defines their behavior as well as their visual appearance, as well as their utility function, how they actually move through the simulation. Each agent then can perform a potential type of ritual. In total, we defined 9 ritual types, which then can be triggered by certain events. We defined 4 trigger types: proximity-based events, event-based events, time-based events, and age-based events. Age in terms of meaning, in terms of the actual age of the agent, which then leads us to a potential possibility of 18 rituals in the first initial state. So, as Cha already mentioned, basically, this organigram just describes the initial stage that we set up and allows for further evolvement of the actual simulation.
Yep. We will now witness 4 rituals that come out of our system. The first ritual is sensing. It is performed by recognition and couple agents in tundra environment.
Next, we have stage 1, hunting for pleasure. You see a predator agent in the highland forest.
Second stage, influencer and trans agents performing baptism in glacier environment. Now finally, we have stage 2.2, isolation agent in highland prairie, performing dwelling.
So, just to briefly recapitulate now, you should still see these conceptual motivations here. Still, this is a project about identity layers and address layers, which are solved by the kind of platform animism proposed. Secondly, there is still this focus on operational images, which we call cosmograms, and they solve the idea of machine-to-machine interaction in automated landscape, specifically the authentication protocols. And third, the idea of model as a space of sovereignty. We have now a running simulation you can see at our website.